Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, what is the regular order, may I ask?
The pending amendment is 1483 by Senator Leahy to S28, the Stock Act.
I thank the Chair. So we're on the Stock Act, and Senator Leahy has introduced this amendment, which I appreciate that he's done that. This underlying bill, as we said yesterday, responds to the concern about whether members of Congress and our staffs are covered by insider trading laws. That is, laws that prohibit a person from using non-public information for private profit. And I suppose most of us here have felt that we've always been covered by insider trading laws. There was some question raised about that at the end of last year. In fact, our committee held a hearing on two bills, offered one by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, the other by Senator Scott Brown of Massachusetts, on this question, and we had some broadly respected, credible experts on securities law that said, in fact, there might be a question about members of Congress, whether members of Congress and our staffs were covered by Securities Exchange Commission law and regulation on insider trading for a reason that would only make sense to lawyers, and therefore it may not be sensible, but I will mention it anyway, which is that the law relating to insider trading is actually the result not of a specific statute prohibiting insider trading. It's the result of regulations and enforcement actions by the SEC pursuant to anti-fraud provisions of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. In those regulations that have become the law of insider trading, a necessary element for a prosecution for violating insider trading laws is the breach of a duty of trust, of a fiduciary duty. And the law professors told us at our hearing at the end of last year that, in fact, one might raise the question of whether members of Congress had a duty of trust as defined in insider trading cases, which is more typically the duty of trust that a corporate executive, for instance, has to stockholders. Now, I presume that most members of Congress would say, of course we have a duty of trust. We have a very high duty of trust to our country, to our constituents. But it is apparently in the contemplation of securities law perhaps not covered by the existing definitions. And so this bill makes clear that members of Congress and our staffs are covered by insider trading laws. We cannot derive personal profit from using non-public information that we gain as a result of our public offices. And that's made absolutely clear by stating that, indeed, we do have a duty of trust to the Congress, to the government of the United States, and most important, to our constituents, to the people who were good enough to send us here. I do think that that provision gives us an opportunity to take a step forward, and it's going to take a lot more than one step to rebuild the trust and confidence that the American people have lost at this moment in our history in Congress and our overall, our federal government. Two other very important provisions, one requiring members of Congress and our staffs to file a statement within 30 days of any transaction, purchase or sale of a stock or other security with the Senate, and that would immediately go online, as will now, as a result of this legislation, the annual financial disclosure statements that we file, so that these, incidentally, statements are now available to the public, but you've got to go to the office here in the Senate to get them and copy them. Well, that's really out of date and not consistent with the general principles of transparency and disclosure that I think people rightly expect of Congress today. So our bill makes clear that both the annual statements and the 30-day statements have to be filed online. And that should help provide the transparency that the SEC itself has said in testimony before the House of Representatives on this bill, or one quite similar to it, would assist them, the SEC, in guarding against insider trading by members of Congress or our staffs. That is, that the regular reporting, the 30-day reporting, and the online reporting would assist them in preventing insider trading. So I know there are a lot of amendments filed. Actually, thankfully not too many, but a significant number. And seeing the presence of the senator from Oklahoma, I hope that he may be here to take up one of his amendments, because obviously we'd all like to begin to debate the amendments and hopefully have some votes. I'd yield the floor to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Collins.
Thank you. Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, before the senator from Oklahoma offers his amendment, and I will not take a great deal of time in my comments, I want to respond to some questions that many of our colleagues have raised about the reporting requirements in this bill. One of my colleagues, for example, has asked whether if a change in a member's or staff's allocation in the thrift savings program would be required to be reported under this bill. It would not. It is not required to be reported under the annual financial disclosure, and it is not required under this bill. A second of our colleagues has brought up a question of how would mutual funds be treated. Again, Mr. President, I would say that the treatment is not changed by this bill other than the time period. Under this bill, as under the annual financial disclosure forms, qualified investment funds, those are the widely available mutual funds that are exempt from trades being disclosed, would be exempt under this bill as well. Now, as with our annual financial disclosures, you still list the fund and the amount of assets in categories for those funds, but you indicate that they are a qualified exempt fund, and there's no requirement for trying to figure out what the trades are within that fund. I mentioned these two examples, Mr. President, because I fear there's some misinformation about the bill that is circulating. Now, there is a legitimate dispute over whether 30 days is too short a time, whether the 90-day period in the original bill is better, which is my own preference. But the fact is that the information that is being reported is not being changed. The issue is how often it is reported. So the inquiries from my colleagues about the implications for the thrift savings plan allocations and for qualified exempt investment funds, widely held mutual funds, remains the same. They're reported, the category of the investment, the amount is reported, but the individual trades within the fund are not reported. And I would like to just briefly, and I apologize for surprising the senator from Connecticut with this inquiry, and hope he will forgive me for that, but I would, through the chair, pose a question to the senator from Connecticut, the chairman of the committee, as to whether or not his understanding is the same as mine with regard to the thrift savings plan and qualified mutual funds.
Without objection.
Mr. President, first let me thank Senator Collins for making these points, because there is concern about this particular part of the bill, and there's a lot of misinformation around. I totally agree with your interpretation, which is that the reporting on a 30-day basis in the bill will not change what is reported, and therefore both transactions within thrift savings plan accounts and in qualified mutual funds will not have to be reported. Thank you for clarifying that.
I thank my colleague and friend from Connecticut, the chairman of the committee. Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing us to pose the question through the chair. I hope our colleagues have heard this exchange, this colloquy, which clarifies what appears to be a rather widespread misunderstanding about the reach of this bill. As I said, the 30-day issue is a different issue, legitimate disputes over whether or not that is too aggressive. We have some of our colleagues who think that it should be a 10-day reporting period. An amendment has been filed to that, to implement that. I personally prefer the 90 days in the original bill. I think that's more realistic. But the fact is there's a lot of misinformation and questions regarding what is reported, and I appreciate the clarification from the Senator, the chairman of the committee. Thank you, Mr. President. And at this point, I would yield to Senator Coburn for the next amendment.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. As my colleagues are no doubt aware, I stand in opposition to this bill, not because I think we should have insider trading. As a physician, I'm trying to fix the real problem, and you're treating symptoms. You know, several months ago, CBS did a series and showed some questionable, but not necessarily insider trading, stock trades, which brought about, given our low level of confidence by the American public in this institution, has raised the question, well, what about insider trading? You know, I honestly believe everyone in our body is never going to use insider trading to advantage themselves over the best interests of the country. But the real problem is the confidence in the Congress to do what is in the best long-term interest of the country. And the reason that the confidence in there doesn't have anything to do with insider trading as we would normally think about it. It has to do with insider trading that we don't normally think about it, on how we sell a vote to get something else out of the next vote, how we trade a position, how we saw positions were bought on the health care bill, whether it be the Cornhusker kickback or the Florida Gatorade or whatever it was. The fact is the American people saw behavior of members of Congress doing things that were politically expedient rather than what is in the long, best-term interest of our country. That's the real insider trading scandal that we ought to be addressing. Now, how do we do that? The way we address that is bring to the floor bills that actually address the problems that our country's having today. You know, every second of every day this year, our government will borrow $121,000. We'll spend $121,000, not borrow. We'll borrow $52,000 a second, every day. We're not addressing any of that in the Senate. We haven't all last year. We aren't this year. The real problem in front of our country is America doesn't see a Congress that's willing to address the real issues and make the hard choices. Hard choices are coming. We will make those choices ultimately. Some of us won't be here. But the longer we delay in making those very difficult choices, like saving Medicare, like saving Social Security, like reforming the tax code to stimulate economic activity and create job opportunities for Americans, that's what they want us doing. The other thing I would mention is I was one of two people who voted against the last ethics law. And I asked my colleagues, did we really improve the Senate with the last ethics law? Will we really improve the quality of representation with this law? I don't think so. I think what we're doing is playing a political game to say we're all guilty, now we have to prove that we're not. That's not what our system of law is built on. Our system of law is built on the fact that we're innocent until we're proven guilty. And the assumption that the Senate is undertaking now is that some of our colleagues are doing insider trading on the stock market. Nothing could be further from the truth. The real inside trading is the horse trading that goes on in this body that's not always in the best interest of the country. This legislation isn't about to earn back the trust of the American people. The SEC and the Ethics Committee already have the power to investigate inside trading abuses. We yearly fill out a report listing every trade we have made. Now, if it's true what the chairman of the committee said, that what the SEC would like to do is have it more refined so they can have better access, then that ought to be the bill that we bring forward. We ought to bring forward a bill that says we, number one, are under the laws of the SEC, Section 10B, and we are. You don't hear that said anywhere, but we are. If our intent is to bring forward a bill to fix the potential for insider trading, then that's what we ought to be doing. But the assumption that we're guilty first and have to prove we're not by making a notification every 30 days of any trade that somebody makes for you, you may not have even been involved, but you may have a fiduciary that you've asked to trade for you. And then you're going to have to make that representation. Has anybody asked the question, what happens if you do have inside information, have no involvement whatsoever in the trade because you put it in a trust account for you, but it's still being traded, and they happen to coordinate at the same time? Are you guilty of insider trading? Or are you going to spend $50,000 to $100,000 proving yourself that you're not guilty? This is a fine institution. It can be better. But it's best when it fixes the real problems, not the symptoms of the problems. Mr. President, I ask that unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside and that amendment number 1473 be called up.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report.
The Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and others, proposes amendment number 1473.
I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered.
This is a bipartisan amendment. This has Senator McCain, Senator McCaskill, Senator Udall from Colorado, Senator Burr, and Senator Paul, as well as myself. This is a straightforward amendment. We've had multiple times we've asked for this, but haven't gotten it. What this amendment says is every bill that comes before Congress and to be considered by the Senate, we should determine whether it's duplicating something that's already happening in the federal government. It's common sense. And all we're saying is an analysis by the CRS, Congressional Research Service, to determine if the bill creates a new federal program, office, or initiative that would duplicate or overlap any existing federal program, any existing federal office, or initiative with a similar mission, similar purpose, similar goal, or activities, along with a listing of all the overlapping or duplicate federal programs, or offices, or initiatives, or initiative. Now, why is that important? Last February, the GAO brought to us the first third of the federal government and outlined to us $200 billion worth of spending on duplicate programs. They gave it to us. It was hailed as a great thing that now we know we have all these areas. 82 teacher training programs, 47 job training programs, 56 financial literacy programs, and on and on and on. They brought that to us. And we all said that was good. The problem with it, we didn't do anything about it. You want to restore confidence in the Congress, do something about the problems that have been identified already. So what this is a good government policy says that before we act on a new bill, that we'll actually know what we're doing and that we will have checked with CRS and they will tell us, are we duplicating, again, something that's already happening out there. One of the other amendments that we should pass is to have every agency give us their list of programs every year. Do you realize that there's only one agency in the federal government, one department, who actually knows all their programs? There's only one. It's the Department of Education. They're the only ones you can go to and find out a list of all their programs. The rest of them don't know them. There's no catalog. They have no idea. So before we pass a new piece of legislation, we ought to at least have the help of the Congressional Research Service, and we ought to pass good legislation that doesn't duplicate. It may be a well-intentioned piece of legislation, but because we as a Congress have failed in our oversight responsibility, we don't know that it's a duplicate when we bring it here to the floor and pass it on the Senate. All I'm asking is let's just do a double check, especially in time of trillion-dollar deficits, that we ought to double check and make sure that we're not duplicating something that's already happening. That's important for a second reason. If we don't know that we're duplicating something, that means we're not oversighting the thing that's occurring right now, the program or the office or the initiative that's out there now, if we don't have the knowledge of it. So rather than create a new program, it might actually give us the opportunity to fix one that was well-intentioned, but isn't working. So what this is a good government amendment. It's bipartisan that says, let's do this before we pass additional legislation. Let's know what we're doing. It's complete and it's thorough. It also will provide greater transparency for both us and taxpayers regarding the impact of the legislation that we're passing. Now, some may say, well, what if we have an emergency? This has a clause in it that says if it's an emergency, that requirement is waived. So if in a case of an emergency that we need to do something, we will waive the requirement that we have to look at CRS to see if there's duplications. So it's a common sense amendment. I would hope my colleagues will support it and that we can, in fact, actually fix the real problems, not the symptoms of the disease. Mr. President, I ask that the current amendment that's pending be set aside, and I call up Amendment 1474.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and Mr. McCain, proposes amendment number 1474.
Mr. President, this is another good government amendment. What this says, and if we want to restore confidence, this is something we should do. It says before we vote on a bill, we're going to have at least 72 hours to read it. It's going to be available online with a CBO score so that when we cast a vote, we actually know what we're casting a vote on and we actually know how much it costs. It just says it has to be online for 72 hours. In other words, we get the privilege of reading the bills we're voting on. And we also get the privilege of knowing the financial cost of the bills, or at least an estimate of the financial cost that they will entail. This transparency is designed to make the Senate better. You want to build confidence with the American public? Then the way you build confidence is assure them that you knew exactly what you were doing when you cast a vote, not guessing at what the consequences and the details of that legislation are. For many pieces of legislation, right now, what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years here, there was no time given, no capability to study the legislation, to make improvements, and many of the pieces of legislation came without the ability to modify it. You can't read the legislation and you can't amend it. What does that tell you about the legislative temperament and thoughtfulness of the U.S. Senate? You can't read it, you don't have time to contemplate it and consider it, and you can't amend it even if you could. That doesn't have anything to do with the U.S. Senate as it was designed and functioned for 170 years. It has everything to do with politics today rather than the best long-term interests of the country. Amendments like this have gained large amount of bipartisan support and have had support in the past when we voted on it. Although we haven't acquired the 67 votes that have been necessary in the past to pass this. Co-sponsor of this amendment is Senator McCain. He understands the importance of reading what we pass. All our colleagues do. Why not put the self-discipline in that we have to, rather than the political moment that says you got to vote on this whether you know anything about it or not? Eight of my colleagues during the health care debate sent a letter to review the health care legislation. 8 of my colleagues who ultimately voted for the health care legislation. And what their request was is give us 72 hours to read this. And the legislative text and complete budget scores from the Congressional Budget Office of the health care legislation considered on the Senate should be made available on a website the public can access for at least 72 hours prior to the first vote to proceed to the legislation. Why shouldn't the public be able to see what we're doing 72 hours before we do it? And just as important, why shouldn't we be able to know what we're doing before we do it? So it's a straightforward, common sense, transparent to the American public as well as to our colleagues in the Senate that now you have the time available to read a piece of legislation, contemplate it, and hopefully have the opportunity to improve it. What's the goal? The best long-term outcome for the country. Mr. President, I'd ask that the pending amendment be set aside, and I call up Amendment 1476.
Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will report.
The Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment number 1476 to amendment number 1470.
Mr. President, this amendment would provide a complete substitute for the Stock Act. And what it does, it requires members and staff to certify that they have not used inside information for private financial profit. In other words, they're going to make an affirmative statement under the law that they have not violated Section 10B of the Securities and Exchange Act. All members would be required to sign the following statement on annual financial disclosure forms. I hereby certify that the financial transactions reflected in this disclosure form were not made on the basis of material non-public information. The Stock Act does not create new restrictions for Congress against insider trading. We all know that. Those restrictions are there. There's no new restrictions. We don't change the restrictions at all. The SEC has stated that the members of Congress and staff are already subject to insider trading laws. They just need some clarity with that. They also would like to have timeliness with that. In fact, all Americans are subject to these laws, including the Senate, found primarily in Section 10B. This provision restricts anyone who trades stocks from using material non-public information to profit financially, and Congress is no different than anybody else. The Stock Act was carefully written to simply reaffirm that Congress is not exempted from these laws. And I believe the chairman stated that just a moment ago, which we would include in this. As such, the bill brings no new reforms to the table, nor does it create any real expectation that behavior will change. It just requires a paperwork phenomenon. All members and relevant staff should have to certify they're not trading on private information. Each year, every member and certain high-salaried staff are required to disclose their financial holdings. Senate Rule 37 also already prohibits any senator or staff person from conflicts of interest. That would be a conflict of interest. Specifically, Rule 37 prohibits the receipt of compensation by virtue of influence improperly exerted from his position as a member or officer or employee. So we're covered doubly. We're already covered under Section 37, and we're covered under Section 10B of the Securities and Exchange Act. If, in fact, somebody fails not to do this, then they'll be liable under the False Statements Act in Title 18, Section 1001, which makes it a crime to lie to Congress. Section 1001 prohibits anyone from knowingly and willfully making any material, false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement to the government. The punishment for violating the False Statements Act is a fine and a prison term up to 5 years. This does not mean that someone who makes a good faith effort but mistakenly forgets something will face punishment. Yet any member who knowingly signs that form in error will be liable for making a false statement on his or her financing, carrying large penalties. I think efforts to reestablish trust in the Congress are important. I disagree with my colleagues that this is one that will make a difference. It won't. Nothing materially changes other than a paperwork requirement. Nothing materially changes other than every 30 days you have to report instead of annually. What is the real problem? The people of this country do not have confidence in Congress because Congress does not address the real issues of the country. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I rise to thank my friend from Oklahoma for coming to the floor and introducing these three amendments. It begins the process of considering the legislation. I want to go back to the first point that he made, which I think is an important point, that we've got to do a lot more than deal with the concern that members of Congress and our staffs are not covered by insider trading laws to restore the confidence of the American people in this institution. It's taken a long time to get us as low as we are in public esteem today, and it's going to take a long time, I'm afraid, to get back to it. The first thing we could do is begin to work more across party lines, to be less partisan, to be less ideologically rigid. And this institution represents people across the widest array of origins, of ideologies, of political policy beliefs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't function without compromise. And when I say compromise, I don't mean a compromise of principle. I mean compromise in the sense that you can never get you could rarely, in a democratic institution of this kind, small d, get everything you aspire to get on a particular piece of legislation. If you get half of what you're aspiring to, or even more, hopefully, that's a good result. Reminds me of what my dad used to say, which was that in a marriage, a successful marriage, each spouse felt that they were giving in 70% of the time to the other spouse. And maybe that's a good guideline for a successful Congress. We're not doing that enough here, and we're particularly not doing enough on the central question of the deficit annually and the debt overall. And the public sees it, so they're upset. So I want to therefore put what we're doing in the STOP Act in context. I think if we pass it, both because of the clarity with which we state that members of Congress and our staffs are covered by anti-insider trading laws and the disclosure improvements that we make in the law, we'll take a step forward in beginning to rebuild some confidence that the American people have lost in this institution. But, oh, Lord, it's only the beginning. And the more we can deal, particularly with the imbalances that we've created in our federal books, the more we're going to restore confidence in this institution. Also, I hope that we can prove on this measure and any number of others that we're still capable of working across party lines to get things done here. That's, after all, why our constituents sent us here. This is the beginning of my 24th year in the Senate. It's been a privilege. This is my last year in the Senate since I've announced I'm not seeking re-election. I'm forced to say that last year was the least productive of the 23 years I've been here. And I hope that we can, perhaps on this bill, prove at least that we can come together and get this done, and it'll be the beginning of getting other much more important things done, including, as Senator Coburn has stated, to do something about the debt and the deficit. And I've been privileged to work with him on some ideas that we've put forward to make that happen. You can't do it and make everybody happy. You can't do it and make all the interest groups happy. But that's not why we came here. We came here to support and protect this extraordinary country of ours that we're blessed to be citizens of. So I say that by way of a first reaction. The second is that I'd like to take some time in that context to take a look at Amendments 1473 and 1474 that Senator for Oklahoma has introduced. The first, to prevent the creation of duplicative and overlapping federal programs, and the second is this requirement that all legislation be placed online for 72 hours before voted on in the House and Senate. Both of these on first response have some merit, in my opinion. Certainly the first one does have a lot of merit. I'm concerned, I know all of us, Senator Collins, Senator Brown, Senator Gillibrand, have worked to bring the main parts of the bill out, are concerned that we not go too far afield in amendments to the bill for fear that it will weight it down and will ultimately get stopped, at worst, that the majority leader will take the bill down from the floor because we're not coming to a point of completing our business, because amendments keep coming in that are not relevant. But these are two serious amendments, and I want to look at them and take a little time to respond. The third, Amendment 1476, I guess is a good news, bad news reaction that I have. The good news is this really is directly relevant to the substance of the bill. The bad news, if you will, is that I'm opposed to it because it really does, it's a totally different approach to what we're trying to do in the bill. I don't think it accomplishes what the intention of most members is on this bill, because it would really replace the entire Stock Act with the requirement that members or anyone in the government who has to fill out a financial disclosure form certify that we haven't traded on inside information. I don't think, as a result, that the amendment does anything to clarify the current ambiguity in the law. That is, the question that we heard raised before our committee by these experts on securities law about whether members of Congress are really covered. And if we don't clarify that we have a duty of trust to bring our behavior totally within existing securities law against insider trading, then I don't think the legislation will get us to where we need to go, and we're still left with the kind of ambiguity that creates the kind of mistrust that I know none of us want to have. We've spoken at length on this question to the Securities and Exchange Commission staff, and I must say that they share the concerns that I've just expressed and believe that if the legislation doesn't explicitly state that a duty of trust exists and is held by members of Congress, then the legislation will not do what is needed to get at the problem, which is whether an insider trading case brought before a court could be objected to by a member of Congress who is the target of that suit. Yes, I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
Through the chair, would the chairman accept that modification to my amendment, that we would in fact establish positively that members of Congress are under Rule 10b of the Securities and Exchange Commission? Would that give you less heartburn?
Well, it would give me less heartburn, but it would probably still leave me needing at least a Rolade. If not,
well, I have plenty of those. As a matter of fact, I'll do better than that. I'll give you Zantac.
That's even better. No, we should reason together. But I mean, as you know, there are three main parts to the Stock Act. One is the declaration we've just talked about. The second and third are disclosure requirements, 130 days, and then the other, the online requirement. But I'm glad to talk with you about adding the requirement of a certification to the Stock Act as opposed to substituting it for the whole Stock Act.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
I would ask unanimous consent that my amendment 1476 be modified with a change to the instruction line only. I'm just doing some housekeeping on that.
Is there objection? Without objection, Lord.
I would make one other point, and I'm not trying to put my chairman on the hot seat. But nobody in this chamber can name somebody right now who's trading on inside information. I believe that's a true statement. And yet we're changing the law not because anybody has done something wrong, but because we're struggling to try to get people to think that we're doing things right. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as we're not going to entrap members of our colleagues. The question that I would have for you is, if we can't name somebody and if there's not factual proof, what we're really putting the Senate on notice for is that, by the way, you're assumed to be trading on inside information now, and therefore we must do this to assure that you're not. Well, I don't believe anybody in this body is doing that. And when we put our members on that position by changing the law to, for example, 30 days, if I have 3 stock trades and I miss it by 1 day, what's the consequence of that? Filing under this bill. What's going to be the penalty that comes out of the Ethics Committee for missing it 1 day or missing one of the 3 trades because you didn't know? We have lots of questions that are not answered. And I can tell you many members of this body have spent a lot of their personal money defending themselves on accusations that were absolutely untrue before the Ethics Committee. And that should be addressed and clarified in the body, the report language of this bill. I have no doubt this bill is going to pass in one form or another. I understand I'm in the very slim majority of people that think it's unnecessary because I think the law already applies to us. And I also don't think we have a bunch of cheats working in the Senate. But would you agree, through the chair, that we ought to make clarifications of everything that we can so we know what the ultimate results are? Or are we going to leave that up to the lawyers on the Ethics Committee? What are we going to do with that? Are we going to determine what the penalties are for late filing or an accidental omission? What is going to be our direction to the Ethics Committee in regards to this?
Mr. President, I thank Senator Coburn. Let me go back to the first point, but it's not the question he ultimately asked. The Senator is raising a very high standard, because I hope that nobody's involved in insider trading as a member of Congress. I presume they're not. There were some serious allegations made last year by people outside Congress against certain members of Congress, small number. They've been denied and responded to by those members. I presume if there's any substance to them, the SEC will be investigating and take action. But obviously, necessarily, if we're dealing with insider trading, we wouldn't know what's going on because they're using non-public information privately to secure private profit. So as you well know, the purpose of the law is to make clear that if anybody is doing this, and again, I know the people here, this is an honorable group of people, but if anybody is acting dishonorably, human nature being what it is, then, and a prosecution is brought by the Securities Exchange Commission, then there won't be any defense that the law doesn't cover members of Congress. Simple as that. But let me come to the other point. I know there's a lot of unease among some members about the 30-day requirement in this bill. That is, within 30 days, you've got to file a disclosure of any trade in a stock or security that a member has been involved in that is a value of more than $1,000. And there's a lot of concern about what requirements that will put on members. Ultimately, the Ethics Committee will adjudicate this. I would assume that there would be some rule of reasonableness if an unintentional error was made, and I certainly am happy to try to clarify in report language what our intention is, but the overall intention is to create transparency. And while I'm on this, and I'll just be very brief at this, I know people are worried about what it will take to fulfill this requirement, and that it's in some sense unfair to ask members of Congress to have to disclose stock purchases or sales within 30 days. But it's my understanding that people defined by law as corporate insiders have to declare within 48 hours of trades they make in their company stock, and staff of the SEC have to publicly declare their trades within 5 days. So it's possible to do this. I gather it's possible to do it by simply asking whoever trades for you to copy the office here in the Senate when a transaction occurs, and then it automatically goes into a database and online. We're asking more, and for some it will be an inconvenience, but we're different. We hold a public office. We have a public trust and public responsibility, and so that's why this provision was in the original Stock Act introduced in the House, bipartisan, and here in the Senate, both by Senator Gillibrand and Senator Brown. And but I do want to state that I'm happy to work with the Senator from Oklahoma on report language that will encourage the Ethics Committee to apply a kind of rule of reason if there's an unintentional violation of that 30-day reporting requirement.
Mr. President.
I'm sorry. Senator from Oklahoma?
I just have one more question for the chairman. If, in fact, this is what we should do, and I think the body's going to agree that this is what we should do, don't you think this should apply to the administration as well? The executive branch? This should apply, the same 30-day rule, to every member of the executive branch who, you talk about real knowledge of inside information, they have it. We don't really have it. They have it. Why would this rule not apply to, no matter who's the president, why would this rule not apply to executive employees in the administration?
Mr. President, Senator from Oklahoma is asking good questions. Let me say first, as a point of clarification, that as a result of an amendment submitted in the committee by Senator Paul and adopted, the insider trading parts of the bill do relate to executive branch employees. The 30-day disclosure requirement does not. And I'm glad to, I'm happy to work with you on this. I gather that the administration itself applies certain disclosure requirements to a group of people in the administration at a cabinet level or somewhat slightly below, but obviously not to all executive branch employees. But we can talk about this one. I continue to be concerned overall that we're going to extend this so far and make it so good that it's going to fall of its own weight and not make it through. But okay, you're raising a reasonable question, and Senator Brown and I just talked about it. We're glad to continue the conversation.
President, I would make the point, a couple. One is we already file all our stock trades, correct? Every year.
We file, that's right, we file annually.
Every change in every investment we have, we file every year. We already do that. We're already under Rule 37 of the Rules of the Senate, which forbids any conflict of interest action that would benefit ourselves. That would include inside information to trade stocks. There are 5 to 10 times as many members of Congress in senior executive positions within the administration that, in fact, this same thing should apply to. And if the important thing is within 30 days, my hope would be the chairman and the sponsor of the bill, Senator Brown, would give very clear instructions to the Ethics Committee on how this is to work. Because I will note for you, last year, 16 senators got 90-day extension on their filings with the Ethics Committee. That's 16%. Well, we've got to have some valve to make sure we don't put the members who are absolutely innocent of anything in a corner because they can't timely respond to this bill. So my hope is, and I will finish with this, I know Senator Brown wants to speak, looking at the timeliness of the filing, I think, is important to still accomplish what you want, but not make it so rigorous that people are going to fall out of that. And we all know how things get busy here, how we come in, we come out, we're traveling, we have all these things that we're responding to. This will be a difficult thing for many members to comply with the 30 days. So my hope would be is that you would look at that. And you would also look at Rule 37 of the Senate Ethics, because, in fact, we're already doubly covered. We're covered under 10B, and I don't have any problem with modifying my amendment to say we are covered, so you cannot have a defense to say you're not. But we're also covered under Rule 37, which forbids any conflict of interest in which you would benefit personally. With that, I yield the floor and thank the chairman of the committee and the president.
President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've enjoyed the back and forth between the chairman and the senator from Oklahoma. And the senator from Oklahoma has raised some very valid points, points that we actually had discussed in committee. I originally asked for 90-day reporting, and it was changed out of committee to the 30-day period. And obviously, I'm happy to work with the senator from Oklahoma and the chairman and the ranking member to determine if, in fact, there is some guidance necessary to ethics, and sure, we're happy to do it. This needs to not only be done in the proper manner, but obviously to implement it in a way that everybody can comply and not be caught, short in that type of situation. So I'm looking forward, and speaking to the chairman, that we will certainly take those valid points into consideration. Any guidance we need to put in for the record or letters of guidance to the ethics as to what our legislative intent is, I'm happy to do that, and I look forward to continuing that dialogue. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
I thank my friend from Massachusetts. Seeing no one else seeking recognition, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
We've been hearing several senators, including Senator Lieberman, debate the Stock Act. That's sponsored by Senator Lieberman. It would ban lawmakers and staff from trading on insider information. Congressional Quarterly writes that Majority Leader Reid's decision not to limit amendments could portend a lengthy floor process for the bill. In addition to the House and Senate, we also have other live coverage today. Right now, live on C-SPAN 3, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is attending a UN Security Council meeting. She'll speak about violence in Syria. And tonight, here on C-SPAN 2, we'll have live results of the Republican presidential primary in Florida, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern, including candidate speeches and your phone calls.
Senator from Vermont.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I wanted to say a word about an issue that I think has not gotten the kind of attention that it deserves here in Washington or even among the general public, and that is the situation regarding our Postal Service. Right now, for a number of reasons, the Postal Service is facing financial difficulties. Number one, it is no secret to any American that first-class mail is declined significantly because the American people are using email and not first-class mail, and that decline in first-class mail has significantly impacted the revenue for the Post Office. Second of all, not widely known, is the fact that the Postal Service every single year now, because of legislation passed in 2006, is forced to come up with $5.5 billion every single year for future health retiree benefits. To the best of my knowledge and to the best of the knowledge of anybody who I have talked to, there is no agency of government forced to come up with anything near this kind of onerous requirement, nor is any corporation in the private sector doing that as well. So the issue that we face, Mr. President, is whether or not we are going to save the United States Postal Service, whether or not we are going to bring about reforms which make the Postal Service strong and relevant to the 21st century and the digital age, or whether we do as the Postmaster General has proposed, cut 40% of the workforce, shut down 3,700 post offices, most of them rural, end Saturday mail service, and lay off or cut back on the workforce of the Postal Service by 40%, over 200,000 American workers. Many of them, by the way, veterans who are now serving and working in the Post Office. So let me just start off again with what the Postmaster General has proposed. Let me talk a little bit about legislation which has been led by Senator Lieberman and Senator Carper, which I think will be coming to the floor, I expect, next week, and then talk about where I think and a number of us think we should be going to strengthen that bill. Number one, this is what the Postmaster General has suggested that he needs to do in order to solve the financial problems facing the Post Office. One, close down about 3,700 mostly rural post offices. And I would tell you, Mr. President, coming from a rural state, that a post office is not just a post office. In many parts of Vermont, many parts of America, rural post offices serve many, many functions. And if you get rid of those post offices, you are really causing severe distress to the identity, the sense of self of small towns in rural America. Number two, what the Postmaster General has suggested is the shutting down of about 252 mail processing facilities, about half of the mail processing facilities in this country. If you do that, there is no debate that you are significantly slowing down the delivery of mail in America. If you used to put a letter in a postal box, it might get there in 1 day. Now the talk is it may get there in 3 days. If today it gets there in 3 days, it might in the future under these cuts get there in 5 days. And here is the fear that I have and many other members of the Senate and House have. If the Post Office is trying to compete against the instantaneous communications of email, what does it mean that you are slowing down significantly mail service? And many of us believe that this is really the beginning of a death spiral for the Post Office, in the sense that many consumers, many businesses will say, hey, what's the sense of me working with the Post Office if my mail or packages are going to get there in 3 days or 5 days? So we think that shutting down 252 mail processing facilities, slowing down mail services, is really laying the foundation for the destruction of the post office as we know it. To my mind, the issue is not whether we make change or maintain the status quo. The status quo is not working. The post office has to change. In my view, and I think the view of many others, the post office must become much more aggressive, much more entrepreneurial, must be going out to the business community, must be going out to the consumers and saying, we have these services we can offer you. I'll give you just a few examples, and some of them, by the way, are included in the legislation brought forth by Senators Lieberman and Carper and Collins and Scott Brown. For example, in a rural state, if people would like to walk into a post office and get a letter notarized, they can't do it today. If people walk into a post office and want to get 10 copies of their letter, can't do it today. The United States Congress has said you can't do that. If somebody walks into a rural post office, wants to get a fishing license or a hunting license or fill out a driver's license, can't do that right now. So I think what we need is a new business model for the post office, much more entrepreneurial. I would suggest, and what's happening around the world, is clearly the United States Postal Service is not the only postal service having to deal with the digital world. What we're seeing in Europe and throughout the world is countries responding by giving their postal services much more flexibility. One example, got a lot of people who are unemployed. A lot of people get unemployment checks. Sometimes in order to cash those checks, they have to go to a payday lender. Why can't they walk into a postal service and cash that check at a minimum fee rather than paying 10, 15, or 20% to a payday lender? So one of the provisions that I think has got to be included in any serious postal reform legislation is a blue ribbon commission made up of the best entrepreneurs we can find, those people within the Postal Service who have the most experience, who will tell us what can we do and how can we raise additional revenue when you got thousands of post offices all over this country. Can they be renting out their space? What other services can they be providing? Right now we have our letter carriers delivering mail to about 150 million doors every single day, 6 days a week, all over the country. What more can they be doing? So the debate that we're having is two visions of the future of the post office. Number one, the Postmaster General is saying, let's cut 40% of the workforce over a period of time, let's slow down mail delivery service, and that's the business model that he is proposing. Some of us are saying that when you have a rural constituency, when you have senior citizens who live at the end of a dirt road, who are dependent upon the post office in order to get their prescription drugs in the mail, when you have rural areas that very much depend on rural post offices, that the goal is to give more flexibility to the post office so they can be more competitive, so they can raise additional sums of funding in order to deal with their financial problems. A couple of specific points. Almost everybody agrees now that the $5.5 billion being required from the post office is absolutely onerous. I have talked to the Office of Personnel Management. They think $2.5 or $3 billion is quite enough, given the fact that we have $45 billion already in the account. You talk to other people, and they will say, given the fact that that $45 billion is already earning interest, that in fact you don't have to do anything. You don't have to add anything more into that account, and it will deal with all of the future health care retiree benefits that the post office requires. So what I believe that we have got to be very firm and say, number one, if the post office is going to survive in any significant way, we have got to maintain 1 to 3 day delivery standards for first-class mail. Second of all, we have got to maintain 6-day delivery of mail, not end Saturday service. Third, we have got to protect our rural post offices. Fourthly, we have got to significantly reduce pre-funding requirements for future retiree health benefits, not to mention that there is also widespread agreement that the Postal Service has overpaid the FERS account, the Federal Employment Retirement Service, by some $11 billion. And obviously, that has got to be dealt with. Lastly, in my view, as I said previously, we need to develop a new business model for the Postal Service, get them involved in the digital age, not run away from it, get them involved, expand what they can do both with state and local government as well as what they could do with the private sector. So, Mr. President, in the coming days, this is an issue that a number of us will be working on, and I would look forward to the support of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.